wonderful afternoon. And I want also to introduce Vina Howard when she arrives, and the afternoon program.
Vina is just grabbing some tea.
Okay, she got some tea. Okay, come on in, everybody. So a little bit of housekeeping for those of you who have recently arrived. There are restrooms out and about the other way. There is a break room here if you just need to stretch your legs. There is a coffee shop on the other side. There is outdoor with fresh air if you want to take advantage of the fresh air. Okay, what I would like is for Kevin, Stephanie, Johan, Andrew, and Stuart to take a seat up where there are seats up here in the front of the room so they don't have to battle the hordes coming up from the audience. And what we're going to do this afternoon is we will hear all of these speakers. If you do not have one of these, please raise your hand. Okay, could Tracy will bring you one of these programs. And our program this afternoon is these 5 talks, so we will probably go a little bit beyond 4:30. Then at 7:30 we reconvene. And at 7:30 we move to University Hall. And University Hall is that large building that was the world headquarters of Howard Hughes Corporation.
No, right down. Right down.
No, it was built as Howard Hughes Corporation, then it was sold to General Motors, and then it was sold to Raytheon, and then we purchased it.
Are you saying it's Hughes Aircraft?
It was, yes. It was their world headquarters. I know this for a fact. I am positive. Yeah.
That's what they're. My father was.
As Howard Hughes. Yes, yes. Yeah. It eventually passed on to Raytheon, but no, Howard Hughes. And if you look at the, over the bluff, oh, Vina, you're here. Okay, good. If you look over the bluff, you'll see the new IMAX World, or West Coast headquarters has been erected outside of the Toronto site. And then YouTube. Have any of you gotten 20,000 hits yet? Okay, if you get 20,000 hits on YouTube, okay, you get 20,000 hits on YouTube, you will be invited to this neighborhood for a week, and they will give you a studio to see if you might really go viral. So this thing that you gaze upon down there is called Silicon Beach, and it's quite the real estate phenomenon, which is vaguely annoying. But I want to introduce Vina Howard, who is an expert in Gandhi, did a SUNY Press book on the ascetic Gandhi, and she's a professor of religious studies and philosophy at California State University in Fresno. And she will be chairing this panel.
Namaste and good afternoon. We are so excited for this afternoon's panel, and we have a great 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 speakers, and you're presenting for both Arnabam Chakravarti and you. So I'll introduce each one of them as they come up to the podium or stand up or however they choose to present their papers. So I think about 25 to 30 minutes each one of the speakers will get, and then we'll take the question answers all together. So please do write your questions, because sometimes my students say, oh, oops, I forgot my question. So do write them down, and then we'll get to those questions. And so the first speaker is for this afternoon is Kevin Perry Maroufkhani, and he's from University of Hawaii.
Yes.
And The topic of his presentation is the past, the future, and the external world. Yoga against Yogacara. Please help me welcome Dr. Maroufkhani, please.
Thank you. I'm a candidate as much as I'd like
Soon to be doctor.
Not doctor yet, but okay. So, good. So yeah, as it's been said, I'm presenting for Professor Chakrabarty. We worked together on this, so this is sort of a joint project, and it's more of a puzzle. And
Come close to the mic.
this is actually, I prefer to just hold it. This will be easier. Better?
Yes.
Okay. So this is a kind of a puzzle, and perhaps not as contextualized as some of you great scholars have done with these sutras, and it's not as perhaps grounded in the same sort of philological study as you might be used to. It's more of a philosophical puzzle that arose, and we've spoken about it several times. So the issue here is the external world realism and omniscience in classical yoga philosophy. So realism about the external world should bring epistemic humility. So there are things in the world that I don't know about, very clear to me, which is a tricky thing, how it's clear to me. But it's clear to me that I don't know them. And this becomes tricky for people like, or deities like God, for example. So anyway, claimed omniscience does not seem to be compatible with realist modesty. Hence, you might imagine anti-realism and omniscience sound more like allies, as they were in the case of Buddhist idealist logicians and who constructed the world out of self-aware vijnanas. Yet yoga refutes these idealists and establishes a pluralist, realist position, while accepting the possibility of yogic omniscience and the existence of an omniscient God or deity or Ishvara. So how do we make sense of that? So as we see here, naive realism is associated with a kind of epistemic humility. There are things that I don't know about in the world. And so for kind of logic jargon, there exists some X such that I don't know X, right? And naive idealism is what I'm calling epistemic exaltation. If I don't know it, then it just doesn't exist. So, I kind of like that. I'd like to go with that, but this is the problem here, right? So, as we said, if realism is the view that things and facts can exist unknown or knowledge independently, then the idea of possible, and more so actual omniscience, appears to be incompatible with it. For anyone to be omniscient is for him or her to know all things and facts, which would entail that nothing would exist unknown or beyond this person's knowledge, what I'm calling epistemic exaltation. This, in turn, is inconsistent with the claim that some things exist unknown to this person, or some truths are beyond anyone's knowledge. So, I've got the whole world in my mind. Okay. So, we have to look at this idea of pratibha and its kind of heralding or deliverer, or, you scholars know, probably have better translations. I've seen it as deliverer, taraka. So, this is a kind of a cognitive excellence attained by a yogin. And this is spoken about in the third pada, 33 and 54 especially. And in Patanjali's Yoga Sutras, in the Kaivalya pada, 14 through 24, we find a vigorous defense of one kind of realism, a kind of the foil is the Buddhist Yogacara idealist, right? Okay, so yet the same text argues for this kind of this excellence, this pratibha. So we should look at this kind of ultimate samadhi. We have sarva vishaya, so it's a kind of encompassing of all objects, right? So I know about everything, every insect that was, is, will be, every unfortunate knowledge, every bacteria in my body, right? I have this kind of all-encompassing knowledge, maybe. Maybe that's what it means. Then there's sarvata vishaya, which is kind of, I think of it as, all the conditions or all the modalities, right? So it's not just to know that this or that many things exist, for example, but it's knowing them intimately in all ways and modalities. So kind of a much more intimate relationship. And this is going to connect to what I think are some important issues about the fragility of knowledge and about what it means to be compassionate and to love, actually. So this is going to be a strange little quick journey. And then, of course, it's akrama, like atemporal and uninstructed. Can this be consistent with realism and epistemic humility? So that's the puzzle, right? So how can we make this consistent with epistemic humility? And if so, again, we need to rethink what this humility consists in, or we need to rethink what this omniscience is. Okay, so pardon me while I... So the concept of omniscience is not merely a theological interest. Naive idealism is the claim that we do not know, what we do not know does not exist. A realist, on the other hand, claims that even what we are contingently or necessarily ignorant about may and does exist objectively. Since omniscience is the logical negation of partial ignorance, to say S knows all things is to deny that there are some things that S does not know. The very idea of knowing everything is crucially and contentiously connected to the perennial philosophical dispute between idealism and realism. So this is just sort of visually getting at what I just said. So yeah, so we see this connection between what on the surface could look like a mere theological sort of issue, and we see how it connects to this perennial metaphysical problem. Okay. So what are the problems? Pardon me. So, as we see, I just for the sake of keeping with tradition, I've separated Vyasa from Patanjali. And what's funny too, sorry, but we've talked about testicles in this conference, which has been fantastic. We're going to talk about the behinds of things here. So we've moved from testicles to behinds, and I'm excited by this. So let's do that. Let's talk about that. So Vyasa has a problem. So the objective world is present. These are just very quick kind of. We can look at the commentary. I mean, it's a subtle debate, and most of you know this. It's a subtle and sordid debate. But the basic idea is that Samkhya has a way of accounting for the objective world. It's prakriti. It's this emergence, this manifestation, as it were, of the strands, the gunas. And every object is forged out of these gunas, and these are amenable to thought. We can think about objects, we can approach them from different angles, but not every thought is amenable to every object. So thoughts can go astray, and we know that they do this. And so this is a problem with a kind of naive idealism. This is just one of the many things you'll see in the commentary. And this connects to like objects in dreams. We can distinguish, that's how we're able to even recognize this distinction, is that there's a kind of difference of the sorts of objects we meet in dreams from those we call the external or real world. And he also says the idealist rejects the objective world, but then belies that rejection by talking about the objective world, which is a tricky little move. And if we do enough philosophy of language, we might be able to make sense of how it's possible to do this. Maybe this is a little unfair, but it is a big thing to try to sort of say that what I'm talking about is nothing, and to take that very seriously. But we know, Madhyamakas are accused of very similar things, and Nagarjuna found, and Chandrakirti, perhaps some ways out of this. This is a live issue, a live debate. But this is one of the problems, okay? And so then let's look at this idealist position that we're attacking. So we know with Buddhism, omniscience is the Buddha knows everything that needs to be known, right? So the Arya Satyas and all the things we need for moksha or nirvana, right, to accomplish this. That's what we mean by omniscience for as far as the Buddha is concerned. The Jains will say that, while they're atheists, they believe that humans can achieve a kind of omniscience, which is really interesting. So atheistic, but believers in omniscience. And if it weren't for the sort of karmic accretions weighing down the soul, we would have this kind of exalted knowledge. And this is that kind of first knowledge of everything, which, again, is very different than the Buddhist omniscience, right? Because Buddha knows what needs to be known. Okay, so now Vachaspati Mishra states that the idealist position in the 414 in commentary is like basically the idea that the object itself doesn't illuminate itself, it doesn't show itself, right? The object isn't aware of its objectiveness, whereas my awareness is aware of being aware. So this is the kind of self-reflexive attitude of the Yogacara Buddhist. So I'm self-aware, I can be aware of an awareness, but this object presumably is not. But it only shows itself through my thought. I can't show this object, it can't be illuminated, so to speak, without it always being illuminated by some thought. So there's a kind of coextension with thought, and therefore the move is we make it equal to thought. Now how do you get there? Let me break it down even simpler. If there is some distinction between X and Y, then they should be independent from each other. There shouldn't be an invariant kind of co-cognition of these two things. But there always is. Therefore, the two things aren't really separate. Therefore, awareness is just aware of itself. I don't know if this helps, but the idea exists without needing an object. Ideas are independent, and there is an invariant co-cognition between the object and the thought. To get an object, you always have to have a thought there. It's always showing itself. So, this is the idealist position in a nutshell. A real nutshell, because we know it can be a much more sophisticated position. But this is the sort of naive idealism that we're grappling with in Pada. So what's the response? Okay, some simple, quick responses. If the object is just the cognition, why does it appear with difference and distinction? Why does it show up so differently than thoughts? Thoughts do not have the power to simply change the appearance, but changing objects can change thoughts. And I think this is interesting, because my first reaction is, well, no, I mean, come on. We've made it through postmodernism, we're in postmodernism, whatever that is, and we all know about perspectivalism. We all have a unique and very special view of the world that is untouched by other people. But what makes it the fact that I can respect that you have a unique view of this object is the fact that it's not a different object that you're talking about, right? And your thought can't change that, but instead the object can afford multiple perspectives. That's a power the object has, and that's a very creative thing, and it opens up a space for creativity to the extent that it's the object's modalities and its power. So I think we're getting at something like this with this response. So we admit the object takes up portions of space. It's a quick, retort. But ideas are not in multiple points of space. Cognitions do not take up space. Objects take up space, and so therefore objects can't be the same as cognitions, right? X has a different property than Y, and so they're not the same thing. Right? Leibniz's law. So even if there were ideas taking up multiple points, and I promised you we would get to the backside of things, how do we get the idea that there is a back to the object that is not perceivable? When you see me, you see me as a, hopefully not such a round individual, but round enough, and you you have a back to me, even though you don't see that back. And it's part of how you see my front. It's part of the phenomena of seeing me as a round, three-dimensional being. So how do we get there? If our idea, if the object's dependent upon the idea, how do we get the absence that's required for a presence? Okay, so Patanjali. Now I use this word perspectivalism. Obviously, this is not in the Sanskrit. And you know, I'm not using it as rigorously as like you'd find, say, in the early stuff on kind of these 90s readings of Nietzsche. You'll find this Nehemiah's book, that sort of perspectivalism, but it's similar. Basically, how can we honor, as I was saying earlier, multiple perspectives of a single object if that object is just an idea inside of one mind? How do we honor it? These perspectives. And honor is going to become important, especially when it comes to compassion. Vyasa, assuming that this is a different human being that wrote this, Vyasa has a simple answer. Let's just admit there's a single and common object by its own power appearing to many minds at once, and we admit that the object is outside of the mind. That's a good response. I mean, argument from best explanation. Okay, so now I think that we find, and if you mark these down, you can see, so 416, this is obviously the Pada, and some of the stuff that I kind of twisted in my own ways or appropriated out of the commentary. So when Berkeley's God goes to sleep, so what if one supermind contained all ideas? Does it get to switch off? And we're going to find this in the commentary, this type of question being asked, this rhetorical question. And what happens when it does switch off? Does the external world perish? And then again, are objects flat? Would we deprive them of their dimensional roundness, having backs, and unknown, basically the unknown in the person that you meet and in the object that you see, which makes them a round, whole person / object. Back is only back by virtue of disappearing from view. It's exactly by its absence that back is present. And we have to ask, if that's the case, then we need something like a supreme being. So Berkeley's God would have to be busy supporting the behinds of everything. Okay. So we've gone through the the Patanjali's attack against idealism. We know there's a kind of omniscience in this ultimate samadhi. So now I want to introduce the dumb dude's dialogue with the deity. Okay. All right. And I had a different title here. Chakrabarti came up with that dumb dude thing, and I think it's good. And he's probably talking about me, so this is great. So let's talk about this. The dumb dude. Okay, my dialogue, his title. Okay, so I don't get it. How could I have made that mistake? I'm an idiot. I can't believe I didn't see the solution. It was staring me in the face. And then you ask, how about you, God? You get it? You get what I'm talking about? So, God, yeah, I see how you make mistakes and don't get it. I know what it's like to make a mistake. Sorry. I planned that. That's how smart I am. Okay, well this is perfect, right? This is just the speech acts we were asking about earlier. What a perfect performative. Okay, so let's look. So, no, you don't get it. You've never been mistaken. So this is annoying. Just think of it in plain terms, you know, when the person, a lot of you work in therapy and grief counseling, you know, I myself have heard this a million times. You don't get it. You can't possibly know. And at the same time, they're right. At the same time, that kind of bothers me. Because it seems that I have to do everything that somebody else has done in order to have any sort of information about what they could possibly be going through. And, you know, we know this, if we believe in the pramana of analogy, analogical thinking can do a lot of work for us. But there is also a truth to the fact that I cannot have your unique pain experience. to some extent, I can't know just by flipping through the news how terrible things really look. I can only guess. So, God. Didn't that smart theologian Charles Hartshorne say something like this? That I grow more knowledgeable as the world unfolds more and more? I mean, come on. I don't know whether to disagree or to agree. If I stick to the traditional notion, again, more mistakes. I wrote this furiously this morning. If I stick to the traditional notion of my timelessly perfect omniscience, then of course I have no chance of getting better, right? It's timeless, it's atemporal. You, though, all of us, keep improving. We have new tablets, we have 4G, we have smartphones. It just gets better, you know. Charter has Spectrum now. AT&T has Uverse. What else could we ask for? But I stay the same boringly perfect, omniscient being forever. This is a problem. But if we agree with Hartshorne, then I do not get to be the first teacher of all teachers, as Patanjali called me in the Yoga Sutras. Sorry. Again, I wrote this right before. So I can sort of, okay, I'm waiting for epistemic promotions as my growing creation gets more and more complex and information piles up. Okay. Now, this is what the dumb dude says. He's getting smarter. He says, did I hear you say I don't know whether to agree or disagree? Pardon my arrogance, but you don't get to admit that you don't know something. It's your job to know everything. Okay, so you get the gist. This is the problem with the omniscience. So there's a conceptual problem with the notion itself. But I'm not necessarily saying, therefore, that the notion has to be thrown out. We just have to rethink things here. And this is part of what I was speaking about earlier, is that to support you in your grief, okay, Edith Stein wrote a great deal about this, right? I cannot become your grief. I can't become you. That's not what empathy is. You and I must maintain epistemic and empathic difference. I mean, just think about it that way. If you come to me in total grief, and we call it, what is it called? A compassion burnout, right? And I take your grief, I'm not going to be a very good support for you, right? So there has to be distance, and there has to be sameness or connection, unity and difference. To support you in your grief, I cannot be so far removed, though, that I don't get you. So I can't be too distant. So this is a real balancing act. So I must both absorb your grief and distance myself. So this talk about identificatory empathy is closely connected to the compassionate Buddha's need for omniscience. If Buddha has to eliminate the suffering of all living beings, right? He teaches, right? He chooses to teach. And the Bodhisattva final, I mean, this is right, the idea of the Mahayana is that you become Buddha with this final plea, this infinite vow that can never actually be achieved. So if that's what it is to be Buddha, does he have to feel those sufferings? And do we find ourselves in a very similar sort of situation here with this problem of omniscience and what it means to be above it and in it at the same time, right? Immanence and, well, no, don't connect it to that discussion. But so I should wrap up here for everyone else. So could this be some sort of solution? So in 337, again, these are my terribly quick, just, translations. They're not even translations, they're just my ideas. We have to avoid getting caught up in the siddhis. We have to avoid getting caught up in all these amazing supernatural powers that are available for achieving, as you achieve and you go further as a practitioner. They get in the way of moksha, ultimately. They have to be let go of. Right? So this is vairagya. We have to achieve this kind of dispassion. And yet, what we achieve is a kind of exaltation, a kind of omniscience. But to know your pupils' mistakes and their pockets of ignorance, the teacher does not have to be herself mistaken. So maybe this is something close to a solution. God's or the Buddha's infinite compassion could simply mean a willingness to feel the suffering and ignorance of others by knowing, quote unquote, hey, where you're coming from. So we have to get a sense of what is this, where are you coming from, and how to make sense of this. So, I proposed omniscience could be thought of as a willingness and a motivation to know all by being all, in the sense of participation in the unity possible amid the simultaneous acknowledgement of difference. I can absorb the world through compassionate connection, while at the same time allowing you to have the space or the sides of yourself or the behind that you have, right? That I can't know. I can connect to you compassionately, but give you the freedom to be a self that is not myself. And so there is a lot of talk about unity, and I just would like to read, Professor Chakravarti wrote this last part, and where he might be going with things. This is quoting him. He says, each of us is divine in a sense. Each of us participates in that universal subjective consciousness. So he's got the universality there, upon which our individual egos are somehow superimposed. So he's got the individuality there. To be in touch with that pure consciousness is to first achieve and then ignore a kind of all-embracing epistemological omnipotence, knowing all by being all. But as the Yoga Sutras say, one achieves liberation only after one has set aside pratibha, knowledge of all things with the ultimate dispassion and detachment. When the highest meditation yields such maximum cognitive wealth, the freedom seeker feels, what do I do with this unlimited understanding and knowledge? It's of no use to the self who witnesses this but stays aloof. And to me that's a kind of like the Buddha's story, right? I mean, he's walking around in a daze, presumably. What does he do with what he's seen? There's really nothing to do, is there? Or is there? And that's the question. And how does that relate to being able to come down and not be omniscient? So that's everything.
Thank you so much.
Thank you.
I want to get there, to have that omniscience. So our next speaker is Professor...
why don't we take just a couple of questions?
Shall we? Okay.
Because it's very different.
All right, let's take a couple of questions.
My first question.
All right. Yes.
Since I was up here, so I guess this, rather than me asking questions just to Kevin or all these great philologists here, what is this God like? Because we had this lengthy discussion in Risha with Edwin Bryant, and his God seems to be absolutely perfect. My God seems to be more pathetic than his God. And I'm worried whether I'm missing out in this kind omniscient God. First of all, creator God kind of thing, I don't see that is the case with the Yoga Sutra. But let's move beyond that. Klesha karu pakasaya paramishta purusha vishesha ishvara. And the next one goes like Tatra niratisayam sarvagya bijam. Am I correct? The two terms I would like to learn from all of you. One is the use of niratisaya, and the next is bija. I'm sure he is carefully using these terms. Number one, why would God have a niratisaya sarvagyata if people like myself would not have some form of sarvagyata? So what that means, let me finish it. So what that means is then this omniscience is also a relative term. So I'm omniscient always. When I start the semester, I have never finished reading the last chapters of the book. My students believe that I know the whole thing. And I'm omniscient then. By the time I end the semester, I end the book, I'm omniscient. Even then, I survive as omniscient. So I think God, in that regard, could be like me. He just knows even more than I do. Like when I was growing up, my dad was like almighty, you know, in that sense. And then bija, I think he just has the potential. Otherwise, why is he just not Sarvagya and Sarvagya Bija? Thank you.
Okay, does anyone want to comment?
I think one person did deal with that issue, which dealt with, speaking louder, that is God's omniscience is not that this person in 1 hour is going to do some harmful thing. It's omniscience of what can be known by truth, which follows universal rules. That's where his omniscience is. That is the way I understood it.
You said you didn't understand what Atishayo meant.
One second,
But that's Anselm. That's the ontological argument. That's the perfection, and that's the idea that and Vyasa has a wonderful exposition of that, where he says, if anyone were better, that would be God. So that's just like Anselm's ontological conception, that nothing greater than which can be conceived.
He's greater, not like the greatest.
That nothing greater than which can be conceived. It's the greatest being, the perfect
He's
being.
always greater than me.
And Vyasa explains that very clearly. If someone were better, then that would be Ishvara.
Okay, we'll have a wonderful discussion afterwards, so it's great.
I'm just curious, you describe God, and when you talk about God or whatever, as an object, objectively. Would you say that the God of Advaita, that is me and that is you, is subjective?
This is a difficult question. I mean, this is our inviting here. This is the invited. But I'm going to say,
Kevin, my friend. If you are looking for real God, you have to get away from Advaita, because in Advaita, Ishvara is Maya Vachinna Chaitanya. So it's illusory. So you are not going to get any absolute God there.
right.
One thing about the degree of omniscience of Ishvara, I think it's absolutely important from a philosophical point of view that there is no change in the degree of knowledge, because Ishvara is a special Purusha, and as such it's a transcendental being. And in order to maintain this transcendental ontological status, there may not be any change in the Purusha at all. So if there would be a change in knowledge, that would mean that the Ishvara would be a changeable entity, and then the whole distinction between the realm of Prakriti and Purusha would collapse, and Sankhya would lose its consistency entirely. So the omniscience of God must be absolute and without any possibility for change.
And I believe I think the Mimamsa cover a kind of objection that's very similar to this, that it is unchanging. And so then we have this problem of the inability to grow, and I think we've addressed that. So it's good that you mark that out. This is a problem.
I have two brief questions. The first one about the notion of omniscience. My question is whether it includes the Atma Vidya, the knowledge of myself as the Atman. When I ask this question, I think of the famous dialogue between Narad and Sanat Kumar, the 7th chapter of the Chandogya Upanishad, which distinguishes between Sarva Jnana as everything except Atman knowledge. The second thing, which is more connected to your presentation, if I understood correctly, you're concluding with ethics. And as I know, Arindam's thinking a bit, Arindam always concludes with ethics. You're speaking about the epistemic humility and to honor. You're using the word there, to honor other perspectives. But my question is whether the Yoga Sutra does not end beyond the ethics.
This is the question, right? Is it an instrumental? Is it one of the ladders that gets thrown away, as it were? It doesn't mean unethical, right? It just means sort of
beyond ethics is very close to. It's not the opposite. It's not unethical, but in a sense it is. Okay.
Right.
the last question.
Just by association about Advaita Vedanta and omniscience. I mean, in Shankaracharya's Brahmasutra Bhashya, I think it's 346 or something like that. The question arises whether it is good to be omniscient or not. And you talk about the distinction between empathy and feeling is crucial to this thing. It made me understand something. In this in Bhashya, Shankara raises the question whether it is good to be omniscient because it implies lots of suffering for oneself. The Purva-Pakshin says, well, I don't want to get into moksha at all and to be omniscient, since every pain on this earth will be mine. So I let it go. I don't want it anymore. And the Siddhartha answers that omniscience is more the empathy, I think, kind of thing. That is, you can be omniscient and yet not as overwhelmed by suffering and pain. And I think this distinction of which you have made clear is very important for me to understand this kind of two bhashyas of Shankaracharya.
Yeah, and it has to be thought through. I mean, yeah, because I think of Shantideva, Bodhicharya Vatara, the kind of self-sacrifice that's justified. And Purva-Pakshin asks this very question, to what extent, why would I do this if it causes me so much pain? I mean, it's a very simple answer. If it'll cause more people less pain for you to suffer, then suffer, man. So there's a question about, the ethics of that, and if there's another way of reaching that without this kind of extreme immersion, as it were. Sorry. Yeah.
I think we should move on because we have, other 4 speakers. Excellent discussion. I think the idea of vairagya is very important here when empathy comes, and I think so we can talk about more later. And so our next speaker is, so let's one more time give a quick round. So our speaker is Dr. Stephanie Corigliano. Should I say it right? Okay, from Boston College, and her presentation topic is The Making and Unmaking of the Self, Patanjali's Yoga Sutra and the Experience of Trauma. I'm looking forward to it. Thank you so much.
Also, I have not quite earned the title of doctor.
Soon to be.
Am I good with the microphone? A little lower?
Yeah. Yeah, want to get
I think if we end it the other way.
Yeah. Physical yoga practice is helpful for individuals to heal from trauma and recover from addiction. Further, physical yoga, meaning asana, postural yoga, contemporary modern yoga, however you want to phrase that, is often contextualized within the historical and theoretical purview of Patanjali's Yoga Sutras. As such, it is important whether or not that is a valid contextualization. It's the case that it's often contextualized in context of trauma therapy. So as such, it is important to consider the implication of samadhi and kaivalya as the detachment-oriented goals that are set forth in the Yoga Sutras, and how these concepts may support or challenge the process of healing through yoga. In written form, the following essay will present evidence for the effectiveness of yoga therapy and discuss its connection to the Yoga Sutras. Subsequently, and in this presentation, I will consider the concepts of absorption or withdrawal, samadhi, and isolation or utter simplicity, kaivalya, in the context of extreme trauma and in the Yoga Sutras. This comparison highlights the need for careful articulation of samadhi and kaivalya in relation to healing therapies and within the field of yoga philosophy. The centrality of discernment, detachment, and meditative absorption within the Yoga Sutras also raises some concerns for the understanding of yoga as a healing therapy. Feminist critiques of detachment-based ascetical practices highlight the particular danger of detachment philosophies for women, who historically have been trained to put the needs of others before their own. In this sense, women are recognized to have a long history of practicing a detachment from self that at times threatens their own psychological well-being, as well as the mental well-being of those under their direct care. This is especially relevant for persons healing from trauma, such as domestic violence, where circumstances have engendered an unhealthy detachment from self. Feminist scholars within Christian theology and Buddhism have recently debated this issue in relation to the Buddhist concept of no self or sunyata and Christian kenosis. This discussion has pushed the Christian-Buddhist dialogue to consider both historical texts and contemporary practice in new light. I contend that this perspective is equally critical in the contemporary developments of yoga studies and yoga therapy. There are some surprisingly strong parallels between Patanjali's stages of samadhi, siddhi, and kaivalya, and the stages of mental illness that result from extreme trauma, including torture. As noted, these parallels highlight a need for ever more cautious and creative scholarship. Some of you may be familiar with the work of Elaine Scarry. Her book, The Body in Pain, published in 1985. I first encountered this text during my graduate studies about 5 years ago, and it has in a sense haunted me. It has stayed with me through my other studies, creeping into my analyses of other texts, calling me to deal with her words in some way. Elaine Scarry's work traces the experience of pain, and in particular the effects of torture. Her work is urgent and directly relevant to our political and social realities. As scholars who study yoga and consciousness-based training that is intended to minimize the role of the ego, the personal doer and thinker, we must also attend on some level to those who encounter the loss of ego in an entirely different context. Perhaps this is one reason the text has stayed with me through these passing years. It evokes a crushing need for compassion and action, yet it is also rooted in consciousness training. In the case of torture, this training is manipulation. It is cruel and involuntary for the subject. Scarry probes the mental coping mechanisms for the subjects of torture to reveal a deconstruction of self, an auto shut-off, if you will, that numbs the individual to the external experiences of the world. However different this event is from the intentional consciousness training of yoga, there is also a similarity of discourse. The following comparison will consider the unmaking of the self through three paradigms: isolation, absorption, and imagination. Samadhi, absorption. In the Yoga Sutras, samadhi is indicative of both an ultimate state of absorbed consciousness and the process of attaining that state. The general concept of samadhi is first introduced in Yoga Sutra 1-2, that yoga is the cessation of the fluctuations of the mind. The first pada explains that this supreme focusing of the mind occurs through practice and detachment. It further notes that this state of yoga, the perception of purusha or soul, is without craving of any kind. As noted in Sutra 116, it is complete indifference to the fluctuating nature of existence, the gunas. Pada 1 then details the various levels of samadhi separated by pragmatic technique. For example, 117 presents samadhi in 4 parts, which progress from absorbed concentration on a physical object to increasingly subtle and internalized aspects of object awareness. This process culminates in objectless awareness. Subsequently, we find the discussion of Ishvara, devotion to God, in 123 through 129, and 8 points of basic consciousness training, 132 through 139. In 141, samadhi is then discussed as samapati. Thus, it is said that this stage occurs when the mind becomes like a transparent jewel, taking the form of whatever object is set before it. This process is initially intertwined with language and thought, 142. Subsequently, it can become absorption without conceptualization. Memory is parishuddha, either purified or purged, 143. This is nirvitarka samadhi, and it involves the loss of memory or the loss of I amness. This process is later explained in the text in 313 through 315 as parinama, the transformation of perception, which in effect blurs the distinction between cause and effect, past and future, the external and the internal. As such, in advanced stages of samadhi, events of the world, including things, relationships, and material reality, may only appear as combinations of gross and subtle elements. However radical or absolute this state of consciousness appears within the text, it is also this change in perception which allows for siddhi, or the achievement-oriented events of pada 3 to occur. Further, 337 suggests that samadhi offers an alternative to siddhi, something other than worldly perfection. Thus, in the Yoga Sutras, the discussion of samadhi oscillates between practical guidelines that are readily conceived of, the Ishvara Sutras and the 133 through 139, and states of consciousness that are ultimately difficult to describe or even grasp or imagine. Further, the purpose or result of this supreme state is logically, although not exclusively, conceived of as immobile and or passive in terms of power and activity. Objectless experience, pain as self-injury. In the analysis of pain, it can be argued that intentional self-inflicted injury or struggle is entirely distinct from other kinds of pain. As such, in choosing to run a marathon, cutting one's own skin, or testing personal limits in some similar way, the pain experienced is voluntary and therefore remains within the individual's control to some extent. However, in the case of accidents or abuse, the pain is inflicted and experience is endured or suffered. In spite of the fact of an external cause of pain, the actual pain is experienced as the body. Thus, to use Skari's example, when cut by a thorn of a rose, it is not the thorn that is felt, but the sensation of one's finger that causes the pain. By contrast, when watching a beautiful sunset, the sensory experience is object-oriented, since the vision of the sunset produces subsequent experiences in the body and mind, awe, peacefulness, etc. If the eyes are blurry or irritated, then the individual may experience the eyes as the source of the act of seeing, but otherwise, awareness is primarily focused on the object of seeing, on the sunset. As such, it is suggested that with post-traumatic stress disorder, the body appears to betray the individual. As David Emerson, author of Yoga and Trauma, a book on yoga and trauma, I don't have the title here, quote, he explains, quote, "The traumatic event occurs despite the fact that everything we are, our physical, intellectual, emotional, and neurological self is trying to help us get away. When this occurs, we can become deeply wounded, left with the sense that our own body has betrayed us by failing to get us to safety," end quote. Thus, the cause of pain is understood to originate from within the body, despite the actual cause of pain from outside. In cases of complex trauma or complex PTSD, such as interpersonal trauma or when the traumatic event occurs over a prolonged period of time or during early and critical development, such as puberty, the effects of internalized pain origin often result in self-blame or self-loathing. Since both the physical experience of pain as well as the psychological interpretation of the pain is internalized, pain is experienced as being objectless. And unlike the sunset, which provides an object for the eyes, the object of pain is pain itself. As such, Skari speaks of pain as distinct from all other sense activities. It is objectless absorption. But is this the same as samadhi? Kaivalya. In contrast to the detail provided for the concept of samadhi, the concept of Kaivalya is remarkably undetailed. The first instance of the term Kaivalya in the Yoga Sutras appears in the 2nd chapter. Arguably, the 1st chapter makes reference to a concept the first instance appears in the 2nd chapter and makes reference to the concept of, is also made reference to in the concept of nirvichara samadhi, maybe similar to Kaivalya. Concentration without an object or upon the most subtle nature of the object. Perhaps this is what Kaivalya is. The discussion of the 2nd chapter is set up with the verse 217, quote, and these the quotes, the translation I'm using is Edwin Bryant's throughout here. 217, the conjunction between the seer and that which is seen is the cause of suffering to be avoided. Clearly rooted in Sankhya metaphysics, it is the separation of the seer, also Purusha, and the seen, also Prakriti, which will end suffering. Then in 225, by the removal of ignorance, conjunction is removed. This is the absolute freedom of the seer. Thus insight, the removal of ignorance, enables the separation of the Purusha from Prakriti, and this is described as Kaivalya. Kaivalya is liberation from suffering, but it is also literally translated isolation, the complete disunion of Purusha from Prakriti. The separation of the soul, Purusha, from the afflicted conditions of fluctuating consciousness is also detailed throughout the Yoga Sutras as a process of attaining clarity or insight. Thus, while Samyoga, the intermingling of Purusha and Prakriti, is most often translated as conjunction, it is also interpreted as confusion. The second use of the term Kaivalya in the Yoga Sutra appears in 350 at the end of the third chapter, following the prolonged discussion of the various yogic powers. Here, Kaivalya results from detachment. Interestingly, however, the same process of samyama that yields the various powers, which require detachment, also yields discrimination. Sutra 352 states, by performing samyama on the moment and its sequence, one attains knowledge born of discrimination. This is followed by the statement in 354, knowledge born of discrimination is a liberator. Then in 355, when the purity, sattva, of the intellect is equal to that of the Purusha, Kaivalya, or liberation, ensues. While there are varied, morally ambiguous effects or powers that may result from yoga, the vibhuti, or power of yoga, is also crucial for gaining discrimination, insight, and ultimately liberation. Accordingly, Sutra 426 states that, quote, the mind, inclined toward discrimination, gravitates towards ultimate liberation, Kaivalya. Subsequently, 434 reads, ultimate liberation, or Kaivalya, is when the gunas, devoid of any purpose for the Purusha, return to their original latent state. In other words, when the power of consciousness is situated in its own essential nature. End quote. This Kaivalya, the return to Svarupa, essential nature, imbued with viveka, discrimination, is also viewed as the utter simplicity of being, or complete isolation. Pain as isolation. How can we understand the concept of bliss and suffering in a discourse that describes the end of multifaceted consciousness? Peak experiences and intense pain may be our only windows. The former, the rushing and release of endorphins, is so powerful that many of us attempt to recreate it time and again through sports, substance, even intimacy. Yet the latter, pain, we scarcely dare to even talk about. Indeed, much of Scary's investigation into the subject of torture systematically discloses the damaging effects of our inability to articulate pain. Pain erases